Support for the Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you in part by University of Idaho, Idaho's only Carnegie R1 classified research university. Our Carnegie R1 designation recognizes the discoveries we make that help our forests thrive. It means we're creating more doctors and doing real research to strengthen cybersecurity for Idaho businesses, our energy sector, and every Idahoan. More at go.uidaho.edu/Idaho-is-Idaho.
Hundreds of bills move through the Idaho legislature each session, and it can be hard to keep track of what's really at stake. The Connector follows the legislation that's gaining traction with clear reporting and local context you can trust. Stay connected to the State House with The Connector, Idaho Daily News. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Many of us have heard of fight, flight, or freeze, but did you know there's another survival strategy that people use to stay safe, and it's called fawning. It's a coping mechanism that can look like excessive apologizing, being eager to please, or constantly prioritizing others' needs over your own. Dr. Ingrid Clayton is a clinical psychologist who recently wrote a book about this phenomenon called Fawning: Why the Need to Please Makes Us Lose Ourselves and How to Find Our Way Back. And she's joining us now to talk more. Dr. Clayton, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Gemma.
So for those not familiar with that term, can you explain a bit more about what fawning is?
Sure. Fawning is a relational trauma response. So, as you mentioned, an extension of fight, flight, and freeze. Fawning is when you lean in to the relationship that might be causing you harm. That might look like appeasement or caretaking in order to lessen the harm. So, it does look a little bit differently than fighting back or running away, in the sense that it's leaning into relationships in order to maintain connection.
And fawning doesn't seem to get as much attention as other trauma responses, like fight or flight or freeze. Why do you think that is?
Yes, it's only really entered the discourse pretty recently in terms of the mainstream. I think for one reason, it's hiding in plain sight. Like I mentioned, it looks like agency. It looks like we're wanting to connect with these people that might be harming us. But basically, fawning happens when fight, flight, or freeze are either unavailable or would make things worse. So in my practice, I see this all the time. People tried to stand up for themselves or fight back, and the harm escalated. So fawning becomes sort of this last-ditch effort to say, I cannot leave this situation. I have to manage it to the best of my ability. And the body reflexively moves in to fawn.
So what led you to decide to write a book about this?
Well, I come by this subject pretty honestly after trying for decades upon decades to crawl out from under something I couldn't quite wrap my head around. I sought a lot of therapy myself. I have 3 degrees in psychology. I've been to the workshops, attended all the clubs and groups, and none of it really, frankly, was that helpful. And so when I discovered this term, the fawn response, which was coined by Pete Walker, he's another psychotherapist who specializes in complex trauma, it sort of put my experiences into a context where I finally made sense to myself. Fawning is not a conscious choice. It is a nervous system response. And so when we've talked about these behaviors historically, whether it's codependency or people pleasing, we've kind of blamed survivors and really shamed them. Like, well, why don't you just take care of yourself and set a healthy boundary? Things that made sense rationally, but these things were not available to me physiologically. And so, it was just once I recognized how I had been living in a chronic fawning response for so long, and that then avails me of tools in terms of trauma therapy and nervous system regulation, where I could finally access the healing I'd been longing for my whole life. Similarly, seeing this change my clients' lives, I just, you get pretty excited about sharing this lens and language with other people.
So, can you talk about what some of maybe their early life experiences or even relational dynamics are that can lead to someone to develop a fawning response?
Yes, it's very common with childhood trauma. So, people that grew up in alcoholic family systems, narcissistic family systems, intergenerational trauma, there's a whole host of experiences where, you think about it as a child, you are pretty disempowered, and we are reliant on our caregivers for longer than any other species, right? We are hardwired for relationship, and we need our caregivers to survive. And so, you can't really fight back. There's just the power differential. You can't run away. Where are you going to go? So, fawning is very common in childhood trauma, where you have to wake up every day and sit at the breakfast table with these people, figure out how to go to school. You might not feel safe, but your body is kind of going along to get along. You're appeasing. You are sensing the moods and noticing what you might be able to do to change them, to brighten things, to essentially take care of your caregivers. And because these coping mechanisms are coming online as your brain and body are developing, this is true for a lot of my clients, they sort of don't know where they end and where fawning begins. And so they're the people that overextend themselves and volunteer, and, they don't find themselves in reciprocal, healthy relationships, and they can't understand why.
So you've described fawning as a form of self-abandonment. Can you
Yes.
talk about what that looks like in everyday life? I mean, like you just mentioned, right? Over committing, things like that. But can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, and then how can someone start to reconnect with themselves?
Yes, it's a very sad aspect that in every symptom or sign of a chronic fawning response, there is some level of self-abandonment. And it makes sense when you think that if relationally my only sense of safety really lied outside my own body. So that looks like, are you okay? Are you mad at me? Do you give me permission? Do you validate what I have to say? I have now lost connection with myself. I'm reflexively turning to the environment to go, am I safe out there? And I may not even know, well, how do I really feel? Right? What would I do if I had, my own sense of permission and agency? And so that looks like really prioritizing other people's needs and wants and moods. It looks like a real fear of conflict. Conflict historically for fawners, like I said, made things worse. And so the body is bracing and saying, I'm never going to do that again. So we don't assert ourselves often. It's hard to have a voice. So a lot of these signs and symptoms are ultimately not intentionally at all. We're leaning towards safety. We're leaning towards connection. But the very sad byproduct is that we lose connection with ourselves. And so honestly, just recognizing this, if you identify these patterns in your life, simply turning your attention inward. And by that, I mean to your body. In every trauma training that I've ever been to, we don't say, what do you think about that? We say, what are you noticing now? What are you experiencing? We turn our attention to the body. And for a lot of fawners, that might be like, well, I don't know what I'm feeling, or I feel numb. And I say, well, what a beautiful starting point. What's it like to notice that you feel numb? Can we linger there a little bit longer? So it's these ways of sort of reconnecting to our relationship to ourselves so that we can notice, what do I want? How do I feel? And that starts to move the needle externally in our relationships.
In the book, you also write about how important it is for fawners to work on finding their no. And you point out that just because you think you can help doesn't mean you should. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about this, because, I mean, I've always said, even to my kids, it's like, it's not your job to make me happy. I mean, even if I'm, even if I'm upset, right? Even if I'm upset at something they do, it's still not their job to make me happy. It's not my job to make my husband happy. Like it's not anyone's job but your own to do that, to make yourself happy.
I love that you're using that with your children in particular as a teaching tool. But the reality is, I'm in my 50s now, and we did not grow up with that lens and language. In fact, I think fawning is often hiding in plain sight because it's taught and it's encouraged, it's expected, it's applauded, right? Not just at home, but in the workplace. It's sort of like, absolutely do whatever you need to do to make me happy. And it's taught even for children under this guise of respect, and I think there's this saying in the trauma-informed parenting literature that children cannot learn to regulate emotions they're not allowed to have. Right. Of course, no one wants to raise like spoiled brats and entitled children. But the reality is, how are they meant to know what they're feeling and how to process it if it's just like, well, smile, go hug the creepy uncle, giving all these other pointers of essentially how to abandon themselves even as children, right? So I love that you're already speaking to this with your kids now.
Well, I think it's important, right? I mean, I have one of my kiddos, he tends to always apologize, right? It's kind of, and I always look at him and I say, you don't need to say sorry. Like, you don't, like, there's, like I'm like, stop saying that. Like, you don't need to apologize, right? And
for existing,
yes, right? Or for having an opinion or something like that. And I think too, can we talk a little bit about what you said about respect and in regards in particular to children? Because I think that we have this culture still to this day where, well, a child, their only way to be respectful is if they're quiet or if they behave or this and that. And I have another kiddo who, I mean, he's constantly, really beating up against that. And, and the one thing I say in my house is like, look, it isn't a democracy, right? I mean, there are rules you have to follow. At the same time, I'm like, look, it's also okay to have a voice. I mean, you gotta follow the rules. So it's a weird balance because I think you don't want to create this fawning, but at the same time, and like you said, you don't want to create a spoiled brat, but how do we, walk through this process with our children in particular so that they have autonomy, I guess, right? But still living within the boundaries of your home, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we have to get really comfortable with that question of how do I strike the balance, knowing that you're never going to get it exactly right, but staying curious about, am I paying attention to both sides of the equation? Because the reality is, healthy relationships involve rupture and repair. And so if we're only encouraging children, and if we're only trying in our, friendships and romantic relationships to avoid rupture at all costs, as though it's a signal of something wrong, or, I don't want them to think X, Y, and Z, we're not actually engaging in the full expanse of what a healthy relationship includes. And that means if for me to be me, I probably am going to hurt your feelings. I might say something where I disagree. And the repair piece is what really matters. It's like, can we hold space for each person in our family, in our lives, to be whole people? And I think people that have tended towards a chronic fawn response, they often need to go back into each of their relationships and say, you know what, I'm learning this thing about myself where I reflexively forfeit my needs or my wants. I'm so hyper-focused on how are you and what do you need from me? And no, I'm good. Oh, thanks for asking. I'm good. And the focus always goes right back to you. And we might need to say, I want to be in a real whole relationship with you. And so that means I might be taking up more space. I might not always be the person to jump in and help. And how do you feel about that? And to extend that to the other person in the sense of, I want you to be a whole person too. Do you notice that there are aspects of your personality or desires that you might be leaving out of the relationship because you think you have to in order to maintain this kind of illusory sense of harmony, right? That's not actual harmony. It's a performance. And can we give each other permission to be in real relationship?
Before I let you go, if someone maybe recognizes these patterns in themselves, What would you want them to know or maybe take away as they start to, really kind of make sense, right, of this survival strategy that they've been using?
The most important thing is I want them to know that they've always made sense, that their body was hardwired for this response. The body will always prioritize safety and survival over everything else, including your opinions and your goals. And we are not meant to live in survival mode 24/7. We're meant to have more flexibility, agency, and autonomy. So I think the most important thing is just to get the shame out of the way. You didn't do anything wrong because you couldn't set boundaries, and just telling you to set them is not that helpful, right? We first have to return to a real relationship to self from the bottom up, and boundaries will come at the end of a longer process, but it's not something that you have to go, oh, I'm broken and now I need to try so hard to be different. That's the wrong solution.
I want to thank you so much for talking with us about this. We've been speaking with clinical psychologist Dr. Ingrid Clayton about her new book, Fawning. It is out now. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.
Hi, it's Terry Gross, host of Fresh Air. Hey, take a break from the 24-hour news cycle with us and listen to long-form interviews with your favorite authors, actors, filmmakers, comedians, and musicians, the people making the art that nourishes us and speaks to our times. So listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.